Thank you, Saranga. It's a great pleasure, actually, to be here today. And let's see, let me share my screen there. Yeah. I want to start actually by congratulating Saranga for 10 years of the Augmented Human Lab. So as he mentioned, he started out as a or didn't start out, but at some point in the past was a postdoc in my lab for 2 years, and then went off to first Singapore to start this whole vision of the Augmented Human Lab. And I have just continuously been impressed by what Saranga and his team have been able to accomplish, not just academically in terms of all the great research that they have done in this area, but also on the entrepreneurship side. They have really taken their work into sort of the real world and affected real people's lives in positive ways. They have done wonderful artistic projects. And last but not least, I think Saranga plays an out of proportion role in the community, the augmented human community, in holding us together, bringing us together like today in this wonderful lineup of speakers and great set of people in the audience. So wanted to start with that first. I'll just give a short, whoops, and sorry, my apologies, I have to minimize this thing first. No, sorry, 1 minute. You would think that after 2 years, I would be really good at this. Okay, there. 3. Okay. So I'll just give a quick overview of the work that I'm excited about these days. Specifically, what I'm focused on is augmenting cognition. A lot of the people in the augmented human community focus on augmenting perception, and augmenting motor capabilities of people. But I think that there's a lot more that can be done in the area of supporting cognition. We all want to either develop or augment certain cognitive skills, such as get better at adopting good habits, improve our ability to focus, strengthen our memory, become better communicators, be less controlled by our emotions, be more rational decision makers, or maybe at times be more creative and so on. And we may desire this either because we've lost some natural ability that we had, for example, due to injury or aging, or we may just naturally be bad at something like sustaining our focus and may want some help with that particular function. So these days, I mean, if people want to improve in one of these areas or want to develop and change themselves in one of these areas, the solutions are really far from perfect. We can read some self-help books or watch some courses or go see a therapist or a coach, or resort to drugs, for example, to be more attentive or to be more creative and so on. And of course, all of these solutions have side effects and disadvantages like expense and so on. And I think that given that we are already now always carrying devices near us or with us, like our phones or our Fitbits, Apple Watches, and all of that, that we should really think harder about how wearable and immersive systems can help people with all of these cognitive issues in real time. So in my group, we've been building closed loop systems that try to sense what a person is doing and what state they're in and so on, with physiological sensing, EEG, accelerometers, all sorts of sensors. And then we analyze that data and try to help a person with some goals that they have in terms of behavior change, So we give them real-time feedback and interventions that can help them with developing these skills that they really want to develop or regain. And from doing this work, we've sort of learned that you kind of have to approach this problem in a different way than how human-computer interaction research is typically done. We actually think about what we build and how we design things in a very different way. And I'll list sort of 7 ways in which this work on cognitive augmentation is really different than so-called good old-fashioned HCI. And my apologies for the people in the audience that have heard this talk before at the Augmented Human Conference or Humans Conference. So one difference is that we try to think of integration rather than giving people a tool. In HCI, good old-fashioned human-computer interaction, typically researchers create tools that people use to accomplish some task. And we think more about integration or interaction as integration. How could a system integrate with us in our daily life so it can help us, it can support a particular function that we want to get better at. And we're inspired really by the vision from the people who coined the term cyborg, Kleins and Klein, who really sort of had this vision that we could use technology to integrate with people so that technologies can free people to not deal with some lower level issues, but they can actually free people to do higher level types of cognitive things, such as being creative and so on, because systems are taking care of some lower level needs that the person may have. For example, in our work, we built a system that helps you with motion sickness. This often sort of gets in the way of enjoying your life when you're in a car, on a boat, or in virtual reality. And we thought, well, could we build a system that really integrates with a person and that can actually help you deal with motion sickness without you, so that you can just forget about it, because this augmentation system helps you with that. And my student Abby Jane and Misha Sra, who's now faculty also at UC Santa Barbara, they designed a system that gives electrical stimulation to the mastoid area, stimulating the vestibular system in such a way that we can counter the effects of motion sickness in virtual reality, or when you're, say, in the back of the bus trying to read a book and so on. So we've published this in CHI 2019 and shown that a system can actually do this kind of mitigating of motion sickness by giving you this virtual sensations of how your body is moving that are basically in sync with how your eyes are perceiving the world. Second sort of design principle that we have found to be useful is to look at psychology and neuroscience a little bit closer, and what people there have discovered about how the brain or how the mind really works, and how people really make decisions and so on, and how memory works and all these things. If you think about it, HCI today and our interfaces today on our phones and so on, they sort of assume a rational user, and they are not necessarily designed for how people really think and how memory really works and what we know about weaknesses and strengths and so on. And I think it is time that HCI looks a little bit closer at neuroscience and psychology and designs really for people and for people's unique irrational nature and quirkiness. So in a lot of our work, we find it useful to look at some insights from psychology or neuroscience. And those often inspire some new kind of system that enhances some cognitive skill in the wild. And then those wearables actually can lead to new opportunities for studies that can give us insights into how the mind works and how human behavior works. Again, illustrating that with a project from our group, we built a system that basically is built on the notion that our factual memory, people's factual memory, is much less good than our episodic memory and spatial memory. So if you need to learn a set of facts, one way that you can make that easier is by turning that learning task into a more episodic or a more spatial learning task. And that's exactly what we did with this system. We taught people who the consecutive winners were each year of the Super Bowl here in the US. And we did that by having them use an augmented reality system, which shows them virtual images that will remind them of the consecutive winners each year of the Super Bowl. And thereby the system is turning that factual memory learning task into a more spatial and a more episodic memory task, because we actually do this while a person travels from the subway station to their office at MIT, which is typically a path that the person is very familiar with because they do it every day except for during COVID times. And they can actually, we show them all these images while they are going to their office, say at the Media Lab, like the Dolphins for the Miami Dolphins and so on. And people can actually retrace their steps, their whole path from the subway to their office to recreate that sequence of Super Bowl winners. And we showed in a whist paper that people who use our system, they basically memorize this factual list once and they don't forget it, or they barely forget it, while people who just study the list on paper, initially, right after studying, they do equally well, but already the next day they've forgotten half of the winning teams. So this is a way to actually learn more effectively that really uses some neuroscience in the design of the system. A third principle that we find useful is to think of systems more as something that is always running and where the interaction can be initiated automatically by the state of the user or the context of the user. While I think HCI in general still very much thinks of the user has to do something, then the user starts using the HCI tool, etc. We need to think more about systems that are always on and always doing whatever they are supposed to help us with. An example illustrating that again from our work is this pair of glasses we've been working on now for 4 years that has EEG and EOG built into the glasses, so that we can actually compute whether a person is being attentive or not based on their eye movements, based on their brainwave activity. And we can help people who want to be more attentive and who want to sustain attention. We can help them with that task by actually giving them some feedback if their attention is drifting and they're being less attentive. We've used this system in numerous studies and have several publications at CHI and in other places that show that at least in the short term, you can make people sustain attention better and perform better on tasks that require attention. We've done driving simulation tests and so on, as well as lecture style systems and more. But it shows how the system is really always on, or at least when you have the glasses on, they always help you with sustaining attention. If you don't want to be reminded, you just take the glasses off. Similarly, my postdoc, Camilo Rojas, built a system when COVID was just happening that helped you learn not to touch your face with your hands, because back then we still thought that it could be very much surface transmitted. So this system actually is always on, and you always wear it. And whenever your hand comes close to your face, it alerts you with a small sound to remind you, like, hey, don't pick your face or don't touch your face, which happens to be a habit that people have. All of us touch our faces normally many times per hour. A fourth principle that we've found to be useful is really to think about all states of consciousness. Again, if you think about HCI work, it assumes this conscious and very attentive user. Pretty much all applications on our phones are designed for me to completely pay attention to whatever is happening in the app. And I think it's interesting to think about sort of other states of consciousness or other states of attention, like how can you still interact with a person who is not paying attention to the app and whose primary focus is somewhere else? Or how can you interface with people when they are asleep or when they are drifting to sleep, and so on. So we've done things like the Dormio system, which actually interfaces with people who are sort of at the cusp of falling asleep in that state of hypnagogia, it's technically called. And the system actually interfaces with them and influences their mind in that moment without them having to be totally attentive to the device, because in fact, we know from the sensor data that they are not completely attentive and that they are drifting to sleep. So I'll skip the results of the study there, but we've also found it useful to think, and this relates to my previous point, about other pathways in which we can influence cognition. Again, today's apps primarily either talk to you or they show you something that you have to respond to, but can we interface with people in different ways? Can we actually interface through the body, for example, like stimulate your body in some way that then influences certain cognitive functions? For example, student Abby again and Adam Horowitz, who did Dormio, have been working on this system that gives you chills. And chills are typically associated with higher alertness, and people remember situations better when they get, or remember something better when they get the chills. For example, when you found out about the Twin Towers falling 20 years ago, you probably got the chills, and I still get the chills when I think about it today. And that really makes your memory be very focused, so that most of us still remember where we were. Where were we when we watched that happening on TV? And we can actually make use of systems like this, of these pathways from the body to the brain and the mind, to help a person with things like attention and memory and so on. So we've actually done experiments where we give people these artificial chills by using the device that I just showed you here with the Peltier elements, and giving them this sensation of the cold running down your spine. And what we see is that not only do people report having chills, the feeling of chills, but it also has these effects that we want to have on people being more alert and people's memory being heightened and their recall of whatever happened at that moment in a movie being improved. Another example in which we've sort of used some of these more subconscious or less conscious influences is all of us are influenced by how we see ourselves, how we see other people, and really the stereotypes that we carry with us. People, for example, think typically that kids or inventors, entrepreneurs are more creative than they are. And we did a study over Zoom that actually exploited that. We used Snapchat filters to turn people into a kid version of themselves or an inventor version of themselves, and did a whole study and showed that people are indeed more creative or slightly more creative when they see themselves as a kid version of themselves, or when they see themselves as an inventor than when they look at their own regular image. So there's all sorts of ways in which we can influence people's cognition and their performance that do not involve actually getting their attention and getting them to really be deliberate, present, and paying attention to what the system is giving them in terms of inputs. We also like to think more of an extended use perspective. Most systems today don't take into account that we may start using some device or an app or something, and that we will keep using it for many years maybe. And I think that we should think more about how systems could change over time and adapt with us or change with us the longer we use them. One of my students has been looking at day and night, for example, systems that can transcend sort of use in the daytime as well as at night. So Judith Amoras, for her thesis, did a lot of work on scent, and she built scent displays that can be controlled very precisely, that give you certain scents during the day, during certain times, like for example, when you're learning something, and then they present that same smell at night during slow wave sleep to take advantage of this phenomenon or this technique called targeted memory reactivation, which can be used to help people with learning and to make them learn more effectively by presenting a certain stimulus like a scent during learning and then again during slow wave sleep. Last, and this relates to Albrecht, his point of increasing bandwidth, we are very interested in sort of increasing the bandwidth between people and systems and really making access more seamless and making it so that we need less, we need to spend less time focused on the device and the interaction with the device, and can reap more of the benefits of the interaction with the device. So in this context, our work on the alter ego system is relevant. This is a system that has multiple electrodes that can pick up signals that you still send to your mouth when you are silently speaking a word without voicing the word. And we showed that you can actually have these electrodes or take the data from these electrodes and train a machine learning model that can actually distinguish between different words, such as the different digits and so on. This type of system would ultimately make it possible to just say something internally like, oh, what time is it? And then hear the answer as if it's almost coming from your own mind. But of course, it is an augmentation system. We use this system also to help people with ALS and MS by training it to recognize their speech, even though they can't voice words anymore. So the lady here is saying thank you, but there is just no sound that comes out of her mouth. But we can train the system to recognize which words from a limited vocabulary these people are saying, so that we can actually make it a little easier for them to communicate with others. So I think we have an unprecedented opportunity to enhance human decision-making, to help people with things that they are not very good at or that they want to get better at, especially cognitive functions. But as Albrecht already said, and in much better ways than I did, we really have to think carefully about the consequences, because whenever we extend ourselves by or augment ourselves, we also lose something. We also, so we gain and we lose something. For example, we may lose some freedom, as Albrecht said, or we may lose the ability to do something ourselves if we have a system that takes care of something on our behalf. So we have to think about issues such as, how do we avoid that the person becomes dependent on the technology, except in those cases, like say the ALS and the MS examples that I showed, where people do not have another way to basically realize that functionality. So how do we avoid dependence by training people and then making the device obsolete, so that they don't need it anymore when they've developed a skill, in those cases where they can develop the skill naturally or internally. How do we assure control, like Albrecht said, understanding that people even realize how the system may be limiting their freedom or maybe working on their behalf, what are the limitations of the system and so on. How do we ensure equity and make sure that we don't sort of build an arms race of ever more augmented people? And of course, super important, privacy. We are talking about systems that pick up very personal data about people and their attention level and things like that. So how can we make sure that people's privacy is protected?